I love the title of this next topic. Dr. Gwyn Bebb is our next speaker, and the topic, the hype, hope, and reality of precision oncology. Dr. Bebb is a medical oncologist at the Arnie Charbonneau Cancer Institute, Tom Baker Cancer Centre, with a clinical focus in the treatment of lung malignancies. Dr. Bebb is the medical leader, clinical research unit, Tom Baker Cancer Centre, and principal investigator for several clinical trials. Looking forward to this one. Let's bring in Dr. Gwyn Bebb.
I think it's still morning, so good morning, everybody. Thank you for the very generous welcome and the invitation to be here. It's a privilege to be present at an event such as this. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm not a prostate guy. I'm not a breast cancer guy. I'm a lung cancer guy. And it seems a little bit ironic that somebody who specializes in lung cancer, which probably has one of the bleakest outlooks of any of our cancers, should be talking about survivorship. I would say really that my talk isn't really truly about survivorship. What I want to talk to you today is about precision oncology and how a good application of precision oncology in our clinics is aiding better survivorship, even for lung cancer. So this morning I'm going to test the technological capabilities of our staff here to its limits. I'm going to see whether the remote advances the slides, and at the end of these slides I want to try to take you through a slightly different presentation, a Prezi presentation, so this is a bit of a new one for me, to outline one of our newest precision oncology initiatives called POET, Precision Oncology and Experimental Therapeutics. So as you see there, the acronym POET stands for Precision Oncology and Experimental Medicine. I want to take you through the hype, sometimes the overhype, the hope, and the reality of precision oncology here in Calgary. I have a number of disclosures to share with you. I've been involved in a variety of advisory boards for pharmaceutical companies, and I've received some research funding from AstraZeneca and Boehringer Ingelheim in the last 3 years. Precision medicine, what exactly is it? I think this statement encapsulates most people's vision of what precision oncology or precision medicine should be. It is the right drug to the right patient at the right dose, at the right time, and in the right place. So you think, well, actually, that's kind of common sense, really, isn't it? And I think the other little trouble with this statement is that I've heard this statement being used as a justification for giving chemotherapy to our patients at home. And chemotherapy at home may be very desirable, but to me, it doesn't matter what you do at home. If it's the wrong drug in the wrong patient, that's not precision oncology. So I think from my point of view, precision oncology is about the right drug to the right patient. So as I said, that's kind of common sense. And I think I need to lay out a little bit of the challenges we face in oncology about this. In front of you there, you'll see a slide showing a CT scan of the chest. On the left, at the time I started treating this patient, and on the right, a few months later. This patient presented with metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, an incurable disease. Our treatment is palliative, it's not curative. Its aim is to extend life and make quality of life better. She was interested in a clinical trial that we had. It was comparing chemotherapy versus immunotherapy. She was brought onto the clinical trial. She met all the criteria, and she was randomized to standard of care arm. So she received chemotherapy. And what you see on the right there shows quite a magnificent response that she had. Right? So this emphasizes two things. It does emphasize that the reason we use chemotherapy is there is a strong track record of efficacy in a lot of our patients. It also emphasizes how important it is whenever we're testing a new, promising, sexy treatment, we have to do a very robust clinical trial to assess how good it is compared to what we're using already, right? So it's very easy to be swept up with the hype of a new agent. Unfortunately, this patient went on to develop progressive disease several months later and died a few months after that because subsequent treatments did not help her very much. There you see the liver with a metastatic lesion in it. What that highlights is how difficult it is for us to say up front who's going to do well with chemotherapy and many of our other treatments for that matter, and who's going to do very poorly, whose cancers are going to respond, and who's going to get all the side effects. Our inability to precisely utilize the treatments that we have is not for the want of trying. We've been trying to better understand who's going to respond well, who's going to do worse for many, many decades. This is another patient of mine who presented not with metastatic disease, but with disease in the chest that we could not take out surgically, but that had not metastasized. The best treatment available 2 years ago for this patient was chemotherapy and radiation at the same time. Now, the chemotherapy that we use is open to a little bit of debate. And I started off with using probably the commonest chemotherapy that we use here called cisplatin and vinorelbine. Now, meanwhile, this patient was very eager to enroll the services of a laboratory in Switzerland which claimed to be able to identify the sensitivities of those cancer cells to various chemotherapy agents. So we sent off some samples to Switzerland, to the lab that you see there on the slide, and back came the results suggesting that these cancer cells were not very sensitive to vinorelbine at all, but extremely sensitive to etoposide. Now, because etoposide is one of the drugs that I had available as an option, for the last 2 cycles of treatment, I offered him cisplatin and etoposide, which he duly accepted. And at the end of the chemotherapy and radiation, he had had an excellent response, actually. Nonetheless, within 2 months, his cancer had recurred not in the chest, but in the liver, progressed extremely rapidly, was resistant to anything I tried on him, and he died very, very quickly. So therein lies our challenge, right? How can we more precisely use the drugs that we have? How can we spare people the side effects, which are actually not very pleasant in many cases, if they're not going to receive any benefit from their treatment? This graph here is showing you a blood marker of a cancer that can be used, something called CEA. It's a little bit akin to the PSA in prostate cancer, but not as specific, and certainly not as wholly represented in the lung cancer population. But what you see here is the journey of one particular patient as her CEA went up and down with treatment. She was a never smoker, and we found that in her cancer there was a mutation in something called the EGFR gene, a mutation that predicts for response to a class of agents called the EGFR TKIs. And as she went on treatment, her CEA came down very rapidly, remained down, and then started to progress again. We tried a variety of things. We tried some chemotherapy. She received a whole load of radiation, more radiation than we would normally give here in Calgary. She found someone who would push the envelope and gave her a very high dose of radiation to the brain in Chicago. Eventually, she was offered immunotherapy because our latest data suggested that immunotherapy in the second-line setting was useful. But she grew right through that. And eventually, through a somewhat fortuitous series of events, we managed to detect another mutation in her tumor called the T790M mutation. And essentially, through the course of her disease, research had been going on and identified the T790M mutation as one of the main mechanisms of resistance to this class of drugs, and a new drug had been developed to attack that. She had a brief course of osimertinib, and her CA came right down. And she remained on osimertinib actually for about another year before progressing, and unfortunately, I didn't have anything that was working in her after that, and she died in late November of 2017. So I think there you have a little bit of a hint of how, on the one hand, we do have effective agents in some people in the form of chemotherapy, but we don't really know how to use them. And then we have some agents that may be more targeted in the form of these EGFR TKIs that have very few side effects, but only work in a subset of people. And even then, although they bring about huge shrinkage of the cancers, they don't seem to be curative. So I think that particular instance illustrates some of the hype that we've had to kind of live with in the field of precision oncology. And I want to take you through some of things that kind of annoy me at the moment about how precision oncology and precision medicine is portrayed. There is a kind of concept out there, almost a dogma, that if only we understood the genetic makeup of our tumors in more detail, we'd be able to identify whatever is wrong and target that particular gene or that particular molecule that is a product of that gene. While I think that is true in many cases, there's a few caveats about that approach. I think the data that we have so far does not seem to completely reflect that assumption. There are a lot of patients whose cancers are sequenced in very great detail, in whom we don't really know what to do with all that information, in whom we don't have a drug to utilize against it. In many cases, it seems that there are some cancers that have very few mutations and that the defects might be somewhere else. And in some ways, that's not a surprise because, as you see there, the great paradigm of life is that information goes from DNA to RNA to protein. And in the end, it's the proteins that run the show. And our ability to detect specific changes in proteins and understand those changes is way behind our ability to sequence the genome. I think as a result, a lot of the concept about precision oncology can generate false hope. A lot of our patients will come to me and they expect to be put on one of these low side effect, very effective treatments, when in fact, I only have that option for the minority of our patients. So while it is audacious to have hope, it is somewhat unrealistic to have the hope that many of my patients have. The other thing that I think is important to emphasize, and we've seen that in the patient that I've outlined experience to you, many of these, well, in fact, all of these targeted agents that we have so far have not proven to be curative. They are better than chemotherapy at shrinking disease and extending what we call progression-free survival. But those survival curves that you see on these charts here, survival curves are very depressing when we're talking about survivorships. But you look at those survival curves, and the ultimate end there for most of those patients is a death through progression of the disease. The other thing that's kind of a little bit annoying about precision medicine is that only a minority of our patients have so far these identifiable targets that we can utilize for treatment. And in some cases, they seem to form a little elitist group within the broader school of cancer patients. So we have our patients who are candidates for these great new therapies and the rest of us. I don't like that elitism evolving. And the other thing that's kind of very irritating sometimes, it is said very often that by identifying targets, we can exclude the vast majority of patients who would not benefit from treatment with these new expensive drugs and thereby save the system money. But actually, the whole point of precision oncology is to be able to have the right drug for all our patients. So I think pursuing precision oncology on this false premise that it's going to save us money down the road, I think, is also something that we should not buy into. And lastly, there's some of these very major biological challenges in bringing about precision treatment to all our patients. And the truth is this, that cancer is an evolving disease. As the disease progresses, as it metastasizes, as it spreads, we find that the cancer evolves. And if you sample a metastatic lesion and do some analysis on that, it is actually very different in many ways to the primary tumor. And in fact, to make things even more difficult, if you biopsy the primary tumor, the results you get in trying to understand the behavior of that cancer will depend on where exactly you put the needle into that tumor, because within that tumor there'll be various clones, each with its own characteristics. So then you think, well, gosh, we don't really have a hope, do we? Just give up right now and go home. Despite that, despite all those challenges, I want you to go away with a message today that I think precision approaches to oncology treatment are absolutely critical for us to improve outcomes and improve survivorships in all cancers. And I think it's very easy for me to use lung cancer as an example, but I think it's very important to use lung cancer as an example for a variety of reasons. It is the biggest killer. It kills more men than prostate and colon cancer combined. In fact, you could say lung cancer is the men's cancer. Right? In fact, it kills more women than breast, colon, and ovarian cancer combined. Lung cancer is the women's cancer. Right? It's not, it's not far-fetched to assume that everybody in this room will have a relative who's been affected by lung cancer. So I think, focusing on lung cancer has a lot of important lessons that we can learn. So, using the Peace Bridge, one of our local architectural masterpieces. I do love the Peace Bridge, I have to say. I've got lots of photographs of it. I'm going to take you through a few things that I think I want you to appreciate that are happening to push forward precision oncology at a local level here in Calgary. Now, the first part concerns the infrastructure that we're building. The second concerns database building. The third concerns clinical trials activity. And the fourth, our media capabilities allowing, I want to take you through our POET initiative, our Precision Oncology and Experimental Therapeutics initiative. These are things all happening here in Calgary in conjunction with the university and the University of Lethbridge, actually. Now, the next set of slides I was given this morning by the director of the Tom Baker Cancer Centre, Dr. Sunil Verma, who's actually directing this building at the moment. So I don't know all the details, but I'm going to try to share as much as I can by enlarging my slides here so I can read them. So the first part I want to talk about is the infrastructure. The main infrastructure that I think everybody's excited about right now is epitomized by that giant hole you see in the corner of 29th and 16th Avenue, the new Calgary Cancer Centre. A mammoth project. I've been in Calgary 5 years working at the Tom Baker Cancer Centre, and I've had at least 4 cancellations of presumed new cancer centre projects. But this time, it does appear for real. There's a hole in the ground. I think I witnessed some concrete being poured, and unless they turn it into, a new slaughterhouse or something else, it looks as if it really is going to be the new cancer centre that we've all been waiting for. The vision for this centre is to create hope for all patients with cancer, all cancer survivors. Its location, as I said, is on the corner of 29th Street and 16th Avenue. And it has a series of guiding principles, which include, improving overall care, retaining staff, attracting research, building capabilities essentially, and making the patient experience that much better. I think the forecast increase in cancer incidence as the population ages and as Calgary hopefully continues to grow is quite alarming. And we outgrew the Tom Baker Cancer Centre as it is 10 years ago. We're already holding a lot of our clinics down at the Holy Cross. So clearly there's a huge need for something that has this capabilities. The scope overview is, as outlined on that slide, includes outpatients, inpatients, treatment facilities, a lot more than we've had in the past. The bidding for the construction was quite an emotional process, I think, for the companies involved, and I think there were lots of tears shed by the company who did not get the contract. But those companies that do have the contract have a great deal to be proud of, I think, in what they're achieving. I think this shows the timelines. The planning has been going on for a long time, actually, and I think the planning for this particular version of the new cancer centre owed a lot to the planning for the previous cancer centre that was cancelled just before the election. I think there was a brief one-year hiatus, and then bang, everything was up and running again. So the cancer centre is scheduled to open in 2023, so it's only 5 years away, and I think there's a lot of excitement amongst all of us about that. Got some additional drawings to show you here. This is the cross-section showing how many floors there are. The video that I don't have here today highlights the kind of heart-shaped structure and how this will form the heart and the center of cancer experience in the city for several generations, I think. The final architectural pictures are very, very lovely, in fact. And you see, not sure where my office will be, but unfortunately, I don't think it'll be one of the better ones. But there you go. Hey. There are some fantastic views to be had from here. The little garden in the middle is meant to be a center of healing. And I think what you'll see in terms of previews, for the interior is also extremely promising. Not sure why that happened so quickly there. So that's, where are we now?
Where's the parking?
Good question. So as I go to work every day, for the last year and a half, I've had to walk a lot longer than I used to have to walk. I can quote a few pains in my hips and knees from, running and rugby and stuff, but, I am able to walk. I'm relatively able-bodied, and I think we're very, very conscious of the great distances our patients have to travel having parked. Actually, there was one episode, I say, a long time ago in winter, but actually winter was only 2 weeks ago, I think, wasn't it? But in car park 6, where I park at the moment, a lot of patients park, and it was freezing cold. It was minus 25. There's a wind blowing through. There's ice on the ground. The freezing, melting, thawing process had led to a Zamboni quality ice film on a large part of the level of the entrance. And I thought, this is difficult enough for me. It's incredibly difficult for our patients. It is hoped that the new car park in front of the foothills will be open by the end of the year. So that will address my walk to work, but I think there'll be a lot of space there for patients to park, at least 3 times as much as there was in the previous car park. And then when the new cancer centre is built, there's at least 6 floors of underground parking planned for that. So I think hopefully that answers your question to some extent. It's precision parking, okay? So that's the infrastructure, but just building buildings and nice offices doesn't actually make our treatments any better, right? So I want to take you through a few other things that we're doing to increase our precision capabilities within oncology. This slide harks back to, a more innocent political era, I guess. This is the Obama-Biden moonshot. But this is a very ambitious plan laid out by the Obama administration, how to address the growing problem of cancer. And it had a number of pillars, but one of the ones that I was really taken with was Pillar H, which is actually not very exciting at all, really. It is just about trying to compile records of how our patients are doing right now. How have they done in the last 5 years, and how have they done in the past 10 years? And try to collate all that information so we understand exactly where we're at. It's very difficult to know how to improve when you're not fully on top of what we're doing right now, right? And compiling these databases and compiling these collections of tissue that we can interrogate at molecular levels is a very important part. That's the whole premise behind Pillar H. Now, locally, I was very lucky 10, 11 years ago now to have 2 patients who subsequently died of their lung cancer. There's John Glanz and Jim Look, who arranged a flow of donor money to me at the university to help set up a lung cancer database. A collection of data about our experience in treating lung cancer patients at the Tom Baker from 1999 to today, accompanied by as much tissue as we could. Right now, we have a variety of highlights. We've published a lot of data based on what we've done. We've got almost 8,000 patient records in that database, and we have about 800 samples that we're actively interrogating at the DNA level, at the RNA level, and at the protein level. It's enabled us to just give you a couple of examples here, address simple questions. So one example I can tell you is, I had a patient who developed metastatic lung cancer. He's in his 30s, or he's 31, right? And then about 2 weeks later, I had this young visitor from Venezuela, and she was a never smoker. She wasn't even 30. She had metastatic lung cancer. And I said, you know what? Lung cancer is affecting younger and younger people. And I don't know what's underlying this, but I need to find out. So ask our people running the database, okay, let's find out how many young people have been developing metastatic lung cancer over the last little while. And this is what we see. fact, the incidence of lung cancer in that group under 47, or whatever age, whatever cutoff we came up with, is decreasing. So unless we have actual data, all we have are our impressions and our assumptions. And our impressions, I would say, a lot of the time, way out of whack with the reality, right? So it's important to be able to understand these things. Another question we were able to ask is what happens to our patients with stage 3 disease who are treated with radiation? Well, we found out a lot of them don't get the guideline recommended treatment, but those that do survive better than those that don't. If we hadn't done that analysis, we would not have realized how few of our patients with stage 3 disease actually get guideline recommended treatment, right? If you'd asked me how many of your stage 3 patients get guideline recommended treatment, I said, well, it's very difficult. Say, no more than 60%. But it's actually far less. So again, doing some of the very basic little things right is absolutely critical to being able to move forward in a more precise manner. There's that bridge again. So we've got infrastructure, we've got some databases. I want to move to clinical trials. So HMS Salisbury was a ship. I was captained at various times by James Cook and Vancouver, and also accommodated a physician called James Lind. And one of the problems in navigating and sailing the world 200 years ago was scurvy. Sailors at sea for a long time seem to develop scurvy, some of them extremely quickly, others within 8 weeks, sometimes 3 months, but inevitably everybody would get scurvy. And the cause for this was just a mystery. Now, it did seem that both the Dutch and the Portuguese seafaring community seemed to have kind of stumbled on something to do with fruit, and they had arranged a number of stops along the West African coast and other places where they would stop off and get fresh fruit. But somehow, the British Navy certainly didn't seem to accept this. And James Lind famously did an experiment. There's a very good biographer of James Lind, actually, who lives in Canmore. He's got a great book about it. And it's a fantastic account of how this physician on board the ship decided that he was going to prove that citrus fruit could actually treat scurvy. And he went about it and actually organized what, I don't know whether it's the first ever, because I'm sure somebody else had this kind of thinking process, but it certainly is one of the better examples we have of a clinical trial. So he identified 12 sailors with scurvy, and his description on it is fantastic. And he randomized them into 6 groups, and he gave them this variety of supplements that you see there on the slide, and that I can't read on my own slide here now. But they include everything from seawater, some various mixture of spices, some vinegar, some purgatives, and of course the 2 lemons a day. And the amazing thing that he was able to prove is that the 2 who got the citrus food made a very rapid recovery, so much so that they were able to tend to the other sailors. Clinical trials are absolutely critical in trying to demonstrate the efficacy of a new treatment. Right? There's waves of stuff coming at us all the time, showing do this, do that. What do we do? Red wine will cure your cancer. Right? Cannabis will get rid of that tumor in your head. Right? What do we do? Immunotherapy will cure you of your cancer. Bring it on, right? But all of these things have harm. They can have side effects. They will cost you money. And they may not cure you, right? So the business of clinical trials is something that I think I'm very passionate about. I'm not the expert in clinical trials, but I think it's incredibly important because unless we demonstrate in a very rigid academic setting that treatment A is better than treatment B, then we cannot move forward, right? So at the clinical trials unit at the Tom Baker, we have great ambitions. We put about 500 patients on clinical trials per year there. Our ambition is to reach 1,000 patients per year. 100 of those on phase 1 trials, making up about 20% of our new patient total. What kind of things can we learn from clinical trials? Well, these are survival curves that I want to show you from recent clinical trials with immunotherapy in lung cancer. This first trial here was published just last year that showed that this immunotherapy called pembrolizumab was better than chemotherapy in lung cancer patients with metastatic disease whose tumors had something called PD-L1 expressed on them. And then, just maybe 3 weeks ago, no, sorry, it's more than that. It's probably more like 2 months ago now. This was published, which showed that the same immunotherapy, but this time with chemotherapy, was better than either alone in a broad range of people, almost regardless of your PD-L1 status. Now, the PD-L1 status here has been used to date as a kind of guide, as a marker of how to use these precision or these immunotherapies. And here we have data suggesting, goodness me, you know, it may not be that important after all. All you have to use is chemotherapy with it. And finally, this very practice-changing trial, the approval for this agent now in Canada came through just in the last couple of weeks. This is immunotherapy after chemotherapy and radiation combinations in those patients with stage 3 disease. And what you see there is notable. There is an improvement in the green survival curve. And what we always look for in these survival curves, there's a hint of a plateau, right? A plateau tends to reflect the possibility of long-term survival. And dare we say it, the 4-letter C word, the cure. Right? These are early days. So despite all these challenges, there is progress in lung cancer. And despite all these challenges, I want to show you some of the miraculous things that can be done when we apply these clinical trial results to our patients. This is a patient with EGFR-positive disease with a CT scan of the lung prior to treatment shown on the left and one after treatment shown on the right. It's absolutely amazing. Right? This is a PET scan of a patient with another biomarker, an ALK translocation. And when treated with an ALK inhibitor, you can see that the PET scan on the left has far, far more yellow in it than the PET scan on the right. This is the same patient. So, having had success with clinical trials, our challenge then is to try to bring these new treatments into our day-to-day practice. And that's where advocacy happens. This is where hard-headed negotiations with the pharmaceutical companies on giving us a decent price comes in. This is where advocacy and powerful lobbying on part of our politicians to approve these things come into play. All right? So getting these things into the clinic takes a variety of expertise and talents. Certainly, it requires a team. It requires a village to bring these things to our patients on a day-to-day basis. We, as I said, in a few minutes we'll go into our POET initiative, but we've had a very great meeting just in April. We had our second annual Precision Oncology and Experimental Therapeutics meeting. We held it at the Bow Tower, generously made available by Encana. There's a bar in New York called Bar 54, because it's on the 54th floor of a building. Well, in the Bow Tower on the 54th floor, there's a 250-seat auditorium. Would you believe that? It's an amazing room. And then at the other end of the kind of curve, there is a beautiful dining room, and that's where we held a meeting. Right? I'm not sure how much it would cost to have access to that, but surely about $20,000 a day, I would have imagined. Right? So through generosity from the community, we were able to hold the meeting there and impress all our visitors who came to speak. This is a picture taken on Wednesday at the 4th annual Glands Look Research Day. So the Glands Look Research program is named after those two donors. And we outlined all the research that we had successfully completed, built on that platform, or based on that platform that we had built. And probably there were two highlights of the day. One was we had a fantastic speaker from Toronto. But probably the biggest highlight of the day was a patient panel. And some of those patients are actually in that photograph there. On the top left, you'll see Dr. Howe, and on the top right, you'll see myself. Between us, you'll see Shanil Pathak, who is the widower of the patient whose journey I showed you with the undulating CEA. Right? He came and gave a very profound presentation on advocacy and how to support patients through their journey. Next to me is a patient of mine who has metastatic non-small cell lung cancer. She's currently 9 months in on one of these targeted agents. On the bottom left is a patient who had surgery 6 years ago, actually 7 years ago, been free of disease ever since. In the middle, next to her, is a presenter from Toronto. And then we have a patient who had chemotherapy 3 and a bit years ago for his non-small cell lung cancer, progressed very quickly, and he decided not to have any more treatment until Dr. Howe offered him the chance of getting on an immunotherapy trial. He received the immunotherapy, didn't have an experience of the disease melting away, but it stopped growing, and he felt better. He was on the trial for a year, came off the trial, and now he's been 15 months with no treatment. That kind of thing did not used to happen. Right? Now, that was the same immunotherapy that unfortunately did not work for the ex-wife of Chanel there. So again, what works for one patient doesn't necessarily work for the other. But we are making progress even though we don't quite understand in whom is going to work best. And finally, and a patient probably gave the most moving tribute, Catherine had lost a daughter to leukemia 24 years ago. And the anniversary of her daughter's death was the day that we held the Glanzlook Research Day. And she outlined how she had surgery, then chemo, and then finally one of these targeted agents, and then a second targeted agent. And now she's been living with metastatic non-small cell lung cancer for almost 5 years. Again, this is something that was not, feasible to even imagine a few years ago. And if you told me 6 years ago that I would have a panel of such patients at our annual Glanzlook Research Day, I would have just dismissed you as being stupidly optimistic. But that is the reality. And if that can happen for lung cancer, it can happen for many other cancers. And as that happens, the focus then changes not onto how to improve survival, but how to decrease the side effects while maintaining survival. And that's where we want to be with lung cancer. So what I want to show you now is what we've been pulling together for the last year and a half, actually. Sunil Verma, when he took on the position of the director of the center, came to me and said, look, Gwyn, I think we need to kind of get into the precision oncology thing. We need to do some trials, we need to do some experimental stuff, we need to do some cool therapeutics. And all of a sudden, he came up with, I remember him in the doorway of my office, came up with precision oncology, experimental therapeutics, POET. Right? And actually, for some reason, once you had a word to describe it, the whole program seems to be coming into force. Now I'm going to just step forward down here. Oh no, you can't hear me then, can you? Because I can't quite see what I'm presenting. Well, let's go through it. So, what is the mission here? This is an introduction to the POET program, and let's see what we see when we go into the mission. So, we want to incorporate novel, non-invasive tests into the cancer experience so we can actually perform individualized treatments and plans. So the non-invasive means that rather than relying on going into people's tumors with zero biopsy, we're going to try and do this without that. So the obvious avenues are blood, saliva, and stool and urine. Okay? So we want to be able to do this at diagnosis, and we want to be able to do it during treatment so we can follow people during their experience and try to detect potential promising results early and signs of resistance and possibly side effects before they occur in the patient. The dream would also be able to kind of continue that kind of monitoring as people are followed after their treatment, after their curative intent treatment, after the chemotherapy and radiation, to see what happens and see whether we can detect the recurrence at the earliest possible time. There are parallels here with, again, PSA testing in prostate cancer, somewhere that the urologists have been for a long time. So we want to have multi-level precision impact. And so what does that mean? Well, we want to have precise cancer diagnoses. We want to have a real-time capture of changes in patients' conditions. We want to be able to introduce targeted treatment based on that, right? Not just chemotherapy, but targeted treatment. And we wanted to do the accurate response monitoring. Every patient who comes into the Tom Baker does have a biopsy at diagnosis. I mean, 99.4%, I think. So we want to biobank those, and subsequently our collection of samples will not be invasive. The other theme that I've tried to build into my program is the theme of using current expertise and capabilities that are already established. And the Alberta Cancer Research Biobank is one such capability. It's actually fantastic. They have the ability to collect, store, aliquot, that is split samples, label them, store them, recall them, already in place. They've got a great robotic storage facility. And so for that, as we collect samples for poets, we don't have to reinvent the wheel to do it well. All right? In terms of blood, what are the things that we're going to look for here? Well, we can divide the blood sample into plasma and the buffy coat. We can't use the red cells, which form the biggest component of blood, but when we spin a blood sample down, what you see is the red cells fall to the bottom because they've got iron in them. And then we have what's called a buffy coat. That's where all the cells in the blood reside. And then above that, we have this straw-colored clear plasma. And some of the capabilities that we want to utilize here are single-cell sequencing. Now, when we take biopsies and do DNA sequencing, what we're doing is actually we're sequencing a whole bunch of DNA that's derived from a bunch of cells. And in fact, what you get is a kind of composite picture. Now we have technology that allows for single-cell sequencing. So we want to sequence individual cells from the buffy coat in the blood sample. We want to do cytokine analysis, that is looking at the inflammatory markers in the blood in patients' bodies. And then we want to use the metabolomic profile that patients have. So a metabolomic profile is a profile of the small molecules, waste molecules more than anything, that are produced by cells in our body. There's a lot of expertise of this in Calgary. And one of the recent little breakthroughs in the metabolomic world is this guy called Ian Lewis, who has developed a metabolic profile of blood samples in patients with infections. And based on that metabolomic profile, he can tell you what organism is causing that infection quicker than blood cultures can. Right? That's very cool. So we want to try to apply these things to following our cancer patients' experience. And then we want to do cell-free DNA analysis. So this means that in the blood sample, we will extract DNA. This is not a new science. This is something that people have been developing all over the world. But it's a means of avoiding further biopsies and still getting to know what genes might be driving the cancer forward. The other non-invasive sample that we want to look at is poop. Right? There's huge interest now in, sorry, I didn't mean to do that, but we come to that in a little bit. But the role of the microbes that colonize our bodies, particularly in our throat and particularly in our bowels, I don't know, it's kind of amazing what this influences. And in particular, it seems to influence the immune system. And as these new immunotherapies are being brought into the clinic, there is now emerging data suggesting that one of the key factors in determining how people respond is what organisms inhabit your bowels. So there are things that are toxic to those organisms, such as antibiotics, even some of the drugs we use routinely, that may alter that flora and affect how our bodies respond to immunotherapy. Okay? So this is just kind of crazy, amazing stuff. Right? It's all happened very recently. So what are we looking for from our patients? So patients who will be consented for this project will have a consent form, and one of the things that we want to kind of outline is that while we outline the progression of disease from stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, you have local disease, eventually possibly metastatic disease. The course of the disease in every patient is not a nice straight line, right? It's all over the place. This is an adaptation of a graph that you've seen in lots of other places, I think. But we need to try to get samples sequentially to try to understand each individual's course of treatment. So the proposal is to, every 3 months, every patient consented on this protocol will come in, have blood tests, saliva tests, and a stool sample, put it into the biobank, and then interrogate it in batches, and we will correlate that with what we find in terms of their overall experience. So who are our, what about our novel biomarkers? I think the microbiome is something that we really want to highlight. Back in November, University of Calgary opened what is probably the biggest microbiome research facility in North America, possibly the world, right? And that is a really great opportunity for us to jump in there. But those kind of head starts will only last, a year and a half at best. And the presentation we had on Wednesday at Glands Look Research Day suggested that Toronto and Princess Margaret are already kind of hot on our heels on trying to do this. But it just shows that the concept is a very special one. And again, our single-cell sequencing capability is something that is actually world-leading at the moment. But I tell you, in 3 or 4 years, it will not be world-leading. It will be just another run-of-the-mill expertise. So that's something we need to jump on. Our research partners include a lot of people so far. We've got the University of Calgary, we've got the Phase 1 clinical trials unit that I lead, and we've got the Alberta Cancer Research Biobank. These are things that we don't have to create from scratch. We've got local research partnerships. We're trying to reach out to small companies and innovate Calgary and innovate Alberta to help this. And I think the prospect of the new cancer centre and the research floors that are already built into those plans are a great catalyst in helping move this forward in a very timely fashion. Already, we've got interest from several companies on wanting to partner with us, and particularly the microbiome and the metabolomic side of things. So I think time is of the essence. We have a great opportunity here, but as always, we need money. And so the big drive from the university is to try to raise $30 million towards this project over the next 5 or 6 years. I already have a donation from a lung cancer patient, actually, who's given us $4 million over a period of 10 years to give us a head start. So, what is my message to you today? My message is that precision oncology is not a new concept, but I think current understandings, technology and capabilities is enabling precision oncology to move forward. It's generated a whole lot of hype, which is very irritating and leads to a bit of false hope. There are many, many challenges in making precision oncology a reality, but actually they are being overcome. And as you can see from that group of survivors in the Glands Look Research Day, through a variety of endeavors, research, clinical trials, and advocacy in particular, we're able to bring these precision oncology possibilities to our patients on a day-to-day basis. I think the future is bright, but there's still a lot of work to do. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll take some questions.
All right, again, if you have question cards on your table, you can fill them out with your questions, and we'll bring them up here and get Dr. Bebb to comment on them. What excites you about what's next in terms of clinical trials? You've talked about some of the work you're doing now. What can we expect, without getting into hype, what excites you about what's coming up?
I think that there's two things. One is in those people whose tumors have particular markers that we can target with drugs. We've witnessed in several of these small populations a first-generation drug, then a second-generation drug, and a third, fourth, fifth, and even sixth-generation drugs. Right? It's quite remarkable what's happened in these small spaces in such a short period of time. Right? I find that very exciting. It gives a series of options for many, but a small number of our patients. I think the other thing that is exciting is immunotherapy. The question of why doesn't our immune system attack the cancer has been vexing us for a long time. And part of the answer is because it is self. It is not a foreign body. It's part of us, right? Having said that, cancer cells are different enough to trigger the immune system in many cases. And despite that, the immune system seems to be switched off. And this first wave of immunotherapeutic agents seem to help unlock that. And in those cancers that have triggered the immune system, it is able to help unleash that capability to attack it. Now, I think what we're learning is that by combining these various agents in certain ways, we're getting more and more positive results. Now, there are some lung cancers that seem to be very prone to coming to immunotherapy, where others are not. Colon cancer has been a bit of a desert. Prostate cancer and breast cancer have not been particularly fruitful arenas for immunotherapy yet. But I do believe that there are ways of enhancing the effect of these immunotherapy agents. So those two things are what excite me most.
Okay, questions from the audience. Is it likely that big data or AI could be used in precision medicine?
Where's that planned? Where's that planned? That is a fantastic question. One of the things I didn't allude to here, but up in Edmonton, there is a very, very strong AI capability. And one of the things we're trying to do is reach out to them to build a partnership, if you like, between North and South. Now, one of the things you learn about working and research in Alberta is it's very difficult to give a provincial face to anything. There's always the flames and the Oilers mentality, right? And so luckily we got a few of these guys to come down to our poet meeting back in April. But yes, artificial intelligence is going to be absolutely key for interpreting this, because in the end, the amount of data that sequencing a human genome generates is massive. And if we're talking about sequencing single cells, we're going to be talking about multiplying that by an order of 10 or possibly even 100 for each patient, and we're going to repeat that every 3 months, right? Nobody here can analyze that. So absolutely, yes, artificial intelligence, machine learning is something that has to be applied for this rapid data generation that we're talking about.
And somebody is asking if a biopsy can accelerate the spread of cancer.
So that is another excellent question. My standard answer to that is no. Right? We don't have a lot of evidence that that happens. Having said that, there are a couple of instances where we do see that. And they seem to be in particular tumors. And the best example is mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a tumor or a cancer that grows in layers. It creeps along the inside wall of the chest and along the outside lining of the lung. It's not a very nice disease. It's sometimes difficult to diagnose, and it doesn't grow in lumps. And sometimes when we put a needle in the chest to try and extract some to diagnose what it is, we find that the tumor can actually track through that out onto the surface. Don't see it very often. I've seen it twice in my career, which of course is extremely short. So you have to be very careful. You can never say never in medicine, and you can never say always. But as a general rule, biopsying a tumor does not enhance its spread. But we are a little bit careful with mesothelioma.
This came up a couple of times. Radon, there seems to be some concern about radon levels in Calgary. Do we have to worry about that?
Well, wow. So radon gas is a very, very bizarre phenomenon, right? It's a natural gas. It permeates rocks and soil. And the Canadian Shield in particular has a lot of rock that generates radon, and actually where we are geologically also has a fair amount of radon in the rock. It is a gas that is heavier than air and tends to collect at the lowest level. So if it's in a house, it'll collect in the basement. It can find its way into houses through leaky foundations, cracks, what have you. But if you have a great circulation system or stuff, it'll also be pumped out very quickly. In new houses that are very airtight, sometimes we can find an increased rate of accumulation of radon. One of the puzzling things is that the amount of radon that we see in the rocks does not predict how much radon each house in that street or in that area will find in its basement. So I do recommend that you have monitor your radon levels. There's radon monitors available. There's a website that you can access to learn about that. Why is it of concern? The reason for a concern is that this is a gas that emits alpha particles, a radioactive gas. Because it's a gas, we can breathe it in. And as it emits radiation, all of these elements will change, and it changes to uranium and lead. Right? So the bottom line is you inhale this thing, and then it converts itself to uranium and lead and continues to emit a number of particles before its ultimate conversion to lead in the lung. And these alpha particles, they would be blocked by a sheet of paper. unlike beta particles or gamma particles. But they're very heavy, high-energy particles. So when they hit the first thing they come to, they do cause quite a bit of damage. So the DNA damage that these things cause in your lungs is far greater than a gamma particle or a beta particle. The data about radon causing lung cancer is nowhere near as strong as it is for smoking and lung cancer. But there is a lot of data from patients exposed to radon in radon mines that suggests that, yes, this is a potent cause of lung cancer. There is a research project ongoing in Calgary that is trying to look at radon levels in houses and trying to correlate them with patients who develop lung cancer. Having said that, we presented at the World Lung Meeting 2 years ago in Denver, a little research project we've done here, again based on the Glanzlock research platform, where we contacted patients who developed lung cancer who we knew had never smoked. And we managed to visit about 50 houses and did some radon monitoring. And we found no correlation at all. Right? So the radon lung cancer link is a little bit controversial, and we don't know how to advise people. But if you drive south of the border to Montana, I can't remember exactly where it is, but for a fee of $120 or $115, you can spend a night in an old radon mine to improve your rheumatoid arthritis or your lupus or whatever else ails you. So,
No thanks. Member of the audience wants to know if you share information with the Tomorrow Project, and do they share their information with you because they also collect samples from saliva, blood, and whatnot?
That is a fabulous question. Now, the person who conceived the Tomorrow Project, Dr. Paula Robson, is now the head of the Cancer Care Alberta research program. So yes, we do have links with the Tomorrow Project. So the Tomorrow Project, for those who don't know, is a very far-sighted project that aims to collect blood samples on healthy people, and then as they develop new diseases, cancers, diabetes, what have you, as they age, we can look at their blood sample from, whether it's 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 or 30 years ago, and see whether there are any predictive markers that we can detect in that blood and saliva that gives us a hint as to what might develop in the future. So we've been in contact with them. We know that of the samples they've collected, I think there are 55 people who have now become patients with lung cancer. So we're very interested in trying to foster that. And yes, so we are in contact with them. They've got the one blood sample for our patients on the program. We'll be supplementing that obviously with a 3-monthly blood, stool, and saliva samples. So again, biobanking, meticulously recording things is the key to unlocking a lot of the knowledge that we seek.
Is the work done at the Tom Baker Cancer Centre coordinated with other hospitals?
So these are all really great questions. Most of the clinical trials that we conduct or that we're involved with at the Tom Baker are not our own clinical trials. They are clinical trials that are being run in many centres across Canada, across North America, and in most cases, I would say, across the world. The reason for that is that in order to kind of really understand the problem and see whether one treatment is better than the other, you need a certain number of patients, more patients that we could gather at one centre in a timely fashion, right? So for most of our clinical trials, yes, the connectivity is very, very strong across the world. There are some studies that we do alone. In terms of the POET program, we hope to take that to a variety of other centres across Canada. That at the moment is not linked, but as I said, we've got a lot of interest from pharma, and we've got a lot of interest from Toronto about collaborating. And then when we go to meetings, such as this, the rapidity with which knowledge is disseminated and shared is actually quite astounding now. The only danger there, of course, is that people jump to conclusions before the whole picture is there, but we are very well connected.
And the last question, how does DNA relate to cancers?
That's a fabulous question. So when we look at the DNA of cancer cells, it does seem to be very deranged compared to normal cancer cells. If you look at those chemicals and those agents that are known to be carcinogenic, they're invariably, although not completely exclusively, mutagenic. That means that almost every carcinogen is something that causes mutations. It damages DNA. So things like benzene, things like radiation, all these toxic chemicals that cause cancer, we believe, cause cancer by causing mutations that give rise to aberrant growth signals within the cells. So the relationship between DNA and cancer is very profound. Then the question is, can you predict the behavior of a cancer cell by analyzing its DNA in great detail? And the answer to that is, well, if we can, it's extremely difficult. And we may have to look at other things, such as the RNA and such as the protein, to get a complete picture of why a cell is behaving as it is. But absolutely, there is a very close connection between DNA behaving aberrantly and cancer.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.